So good morning, everyone. My name is Rola Ajjawi. I'm an associate professor at CRADLE, which is the Centre for Research in Assessment and Digital Learning at Deakin University. I'll be talking to you about authentic assessment, in particular research we've been doing here at Deakin and at CRADLE. I'd like to also start by acknowledging the traditional owners of the land on which I'm based, and that is the Wurundjeri people of the Kulin Nation, and acknowledge their elders past, present and emerging. So I'd like to talk about authentic assessment. What makes for authentic assessment? I'm going to talk about some common frameworks, if you like, around authentic assessment, just to start with, and then go on to some research we did, which looked at student experiences of authentic assessment, or at least assessment within work-based placements. And then I'm going to offer to you a reframing of how we might think about authentic assessment that you may choose to consider perhaps in the breakout sessions, and then finish on some practical suggestions for assessment design. Just to start with, here in Australia, we've adopted this particular definition around will, which I think comes from the work of Jan Orell originally. And that is that will is an umbrella term for a range of approaches and strategies that integrate theory with the practice of work within a purposefully designed curriculum. And what you notice here is that it is actually quite a broad definition of will. So it's an attempt to be pragmatic, I suppose, in terms of being able to integrate a lot of different experiences and opportunities. And much like you heard Nora present, actually with my talk as well, there's a lot of similarities, but hopefully extending from where she ended is to look more at design in a more micro level, I suppose. But just to start with, there's two assumptions, and I think we can all agree on these, especially because you've heard them already today, is that will activities are really valuable for learning, they are important for learning, and that assessment shapes learning. In fact, at CRADLE, we talk about assessment being a real moral act because it shapes who our students become, and it shapes what we recognise as being valid knowledge in the discipline. And again, just to set the scene, you've heard already today quite a bit about how complex assessment is. Geraldine talked about the metaphor of shifting sands, which I really appreciated in terms of the contexts, the setting. And I've just listed here the three key people I'm going to focus on in terms of stakeholders: the industry or workplace supervisor, the student, and the university staff. Recognising, of course, there are other key stakeholders as well, but these are the three main ones I'm going to talk about. So, what do we know from the research on assessment design in will in particular? Because of this complexity and because of the broad range of different will experiences that are out there, we tend to see a different slew or a different set of assessment design strategies in will. And these are the more common ones, I suppose. You know, there's often learning plans that are set at the beginning with some articulation of agreed goals between the three key stakeholders I've identified already. There's often reflection on workplace activities and learning. There might be plus or minus some artifacts from the workplace that are incorporated perhaps within portfolios, such as lesson plans, for example, if you were in a teaching degree. Plus or minus assessment and feedback from industry supervisors, and then project reports are another very common example of assessment design. And a really common way of thinking about authenticity in will assessment typically comes down to these two things, and that is the assessment, represents the context or real life context of the workplace, and this is on a continuum from low to high, and it represents the key activities that a student might engage in that particular workplace. And so there's a level of authenticity there to the activity themselves. And you can see here an attempt to map out, so you can, as a staff member, map out the level of authenticity on this continuum from low to high for these two particular criteria. And these are really the most common ways of thinking about authenticity. And I noticed these in your own documentation alongside actually some other identified features of authentic assessment, which you see here in the AAF, which is comes from work also here in Australia, and as well as recognizing the proximity to the workplace and to the activities, it also authentic assessment is supposed to engage students in high quality cognitive engagement. It should actually engage the student in reflexively evaluating performance, and this is work we have done. We've really put a bit of effort into here at Cradle, is this idea of evaluative judgment, is helping students understand what good looks like for the particular setting, for the particular work. It's kind of this idea that links in with, we've heard already, lifelong learning, and we've called it evaluative judgment. And that finally, industry contributes to assessment. Again, not a new idea there, but that you know, you need to have all three stakeholders involved. But what struck us actually from looking at the literature in more detail was this particular study, and this is from Smith and Worsfold, and they talked about actually, they did some quantitative research, and they showed a correlation between students' perceptions of alignment and authenticity in assessment as being the strongest contributor to attainment of WIL outcomes, and that influences their engagement and therefore learning from WIL. And why this struck us in particular is that notion of alignment, because before, you know, in the two frameworks I've showed you already that talk about authentic assessment, actually there wasn't really a lot of mention of alignment in the sense of aligning goals, activities, and assessment design. But beyond that, it was the students' perception that mattered, and that really got us interested, because what we saw in the previous research was a lot of attempts at staff mapping out authenticity, and not to say that that is incorrect, but what is the student, whose view of authenticity matters when you do have so many stakeholders. And we got interested in the student view as a gap in the literature. And so also just to highlight this idea of alignment, which I've already explained, what struck us as well is that if we go back to Biggs's original definition of constructive alignment, it's something the learners have to create for themselves. That's hence the constructive part of it. And so, yes, it's really important that we do mapping of our curricula, and we do these maps to identify alignment in our assessment, that our assessment actually is assessing our learning activities and our learning goals. But it's not enough, and the students need to be able to see the alignment themselves. And so we got interested in this, and we asked the question, what does assessment in WIL capture in terms of learning goals and learning activities? You know, do the students see WIL assessment as being aligned and authentic to their placement? And this was work that was funded by ASIN, the Australian Collaborative Education Network, who is our national body for WIL. And so alongside a number of alignments, we actually identified both alignments and misalignments in the way students perceived assessment. And I'll show you some of these findings now. I should have said, actually, the way we did this research was we interviewed students across 2 universities, and we asked them to draw. First, we asked them to draw what they learned from the WIL placement. And then with a different colour, we asked them to highlight to us what of their achievements were actually captured through assessment. And that was our attempt to try and really work out this idea of alignment. And then, so once they did this drawing, we asked them to talk us through the drawing, and also we had some semi-structured interview questions as well. So coming back to the alignments and misalignments, and you might be wondering, you know, this is a talk about authenticity. Why is she talking about alignment? And that is because I'm going to get to the point where I'm going to suggest to you that actually students' perceptions of alignment really matter to authenticity. And that's what this research really showed us. So the key misalignments were between assessment activities and students' perceptions of their future selves, between placement activities and assessment activities, and between university and industry roles and practices. And I'm going to talk about each of these individually now. So the first layer of misalignment or alignment, I mean, it wasn't entirely misaligned. There were lots of alignments, but there were misalignments that we saw as well. And the first one is around that idea of assessment activities and future selves. And so the value of will assessment for the students, the way they oriented to will assessment was that it oriented to their future selves. So it was why will was really valuable and useful to them was because it actually got them to have a go at being this future professional that they're trying to become, and to play out that role, if you like, and to see how their developing identity is going. But the issue with assessment is assessment by its very nature tends to put students back into their student role. And that's because assessment serves multiple purposes. In itself, there's a tension there because, you know, we saw that assessment for learning can be in tension with assessment of learning. And I think for me, the way I think about assessment design, it's always a set of compromises, as Geraldine noted initially. You know, you might compromise reliability if it's a low stakes, for example, assessment for learning being your primary purpose. Whereas if it's a high stakes summative assessment, you might not want to compromise on reliability or consistency, if you like. But then what you do is you compromise on validity. So another key misalignment, so the misalignment here was if the assessment didn't actually feed into the students' learning goals, or, you know, it didn't really tap into what their goals were for that particular placement. And so you might say, well, actually, a lot of our students have learning contracts as their first assignment, usually when even, you know, we saw this in our own research, the first assessment was very much typically a learning plan or a learning contract where students, industry and staff got to input in some way or somehow look at this learning contract and come up with a shared understanding for the placement. But where the misalignment happened, although that's the starting point, it was often not revisited during the placement. And so you got to the end of the placement and the goals may have shifted, but nowhere along the line could the student actually take care of that until right at the end, when it might have been too late. And what you see in this quote here is one of the students talking about, let me shift this here. I felt this was actually a really positive quote around the ways that assessment positioned them as as someone who's becoming a professional. I felt the assessments, they were just really more industry-based assessments. So they're really relevant to who I wanted to become. There's actually stuff that we can go out and use ongoing beyond our degree, the resume, even the journal document stuff, working with clients, their actual industry-related skills. So moving on from here, and this is part of the drawing, and it's just a bit of you know, just to show you a little bit about how the student, once this particular student conceptualized her placement, you know, the purple is the activities that she was doing and how she was working with animals and working with different people and building surveys as part of her placement. And then when it came to the assessment, it was very much about her professional development and personal professional development. So, but it was about her as a student. So moving on to the next one, and I think this one is probably a little bit clearer to get your head around, which is the misalignment between placement activities and assessment activities. Where we saw good alignment was performance-based assessment. This is typical more of the health professions, for example, which is my background. I'm a physio by training, and I used to be a clinical educator. But these are the tightly coupled. In the more loosely coupled types of placements, there we saw that typically assessment really assessed a very narrow range of competencies. So they might have had a really wide range of competencies that they learned in the placement, but assessment was typically written or reflective written, and measuring, you know, a very narrow genre. So the students didn't feel like it really showcased their achievements and who they were becoming. And this led to instrumentalism. It became just another tick box that the students had to do. This is a quote from a student saying, the rubric for my assignment is very much focused on our understanding of the structure of a lesson plan and what needs to be in a lesson plan to teach an effective lesson, rather than how actually personally I taught it and how we found the lesson plan either stayed the same or changed during the lesson. And actually, I thought this was really insightful on behalf of the students. And that is because what the student realized is it was important that they did, they were in a teaching degree. Another example of what I would call a tightly coupled placement, because often these placements have regulations and competency frameworks. But the assessment was focused on the formal lesson plan and then reflection on enactment of the lesson plan. And you might think, well, what's the problem there? But what this student identifies is actually there was situated contingent enactments that had to happen because of the particular situation in the classroom that really was never captured in the assessment in a live way. And I thought that was really interesting. And here you see another example of the way that assessment captures a narrow range of competencies. So what you see here is a student, the blue is all the activities they did in their placement. They answered the phone, they did email, they worked in teams, they went to meetings, etc., etc. And yet the assessment was very much about a written task that was, I think there was a mid-placement communication review, and then a final report. So that you know, I'm not what I'm showing you here is that yes, this assessment does capture important things. I mean, these are things that were achieved, but it is a narrow range. And finally, there is a misalignment between what happens at university, the practices of the university, and industry practices. And so there was a mismatch between what they were taught at the university and how it was practiced at the workplace. And the learning regarding local enactments and variabilities of practice were not capitalized on. Assessment was mostly university driven, and this led to cynicism because the students felt that the role of the supervisor in the workplace wasn't really being adequately given the regard it should be, because the industry is the real world, not the university. And so what's interesting here for me is that, of course, there will be gaps between the practices in the university and the practices in a workplace. They have different purposes. And the question I would get curious about here is, why might that be the case? And to get students to think about how the difference in context might lead to different practices. In terms of the role of the supervisor, a lot of the assessments we saw, because of the issues of consistency, and I completely get this, there is research that shows that typically workplace supervisors tend to be more lenient in their marking, and that's work by Denise Jackson and colleagues. But it comes back to that quote Geraldine had. So what we do to deal with that is we say, okay, well, supervisors can give feedback and they can rate you know, on a rating scale at the end, but we'll call it a hurdle. So it's only pass and fail, and then the report is what we get marks for. And so you can see how this devalues whether the information that the supervisor gives in the eyes of the student, because in the university, it's the marks that matter. And you see this in this quote, the way we're taught to document here at uni and they go out into the workplace, it's like not necessarily the same at all. That's the issue of the difference in practice. So that's frustrating when you're getting assessed at uni, and you've got to tick these boxes, but it's like, that's not even the way they do it in the real world. A lot of my research is in medical education, and there's been a big push for national competency frameworks, which really act to coordinate between university and what's happening in the workplace through the language of the standards. But the assessors don't necessarily, the workplace supervisors don't necessarily understand that language. It doesn't speak to them in what they do on a day-to-day placement in the workplace. And so it becomes detached from the day-to-day, and then it's merely a tick box exercise for the university to get done. And that also leads to cynicism and instrumentalism. So I'm conscious of time, and I want to get to the reframing as I'm coming towards the end of my time. So what does this add in terms of our understanding of authentic assessment? Firstly, that the alignment between the university, industry, and student needs to be seen as a component of authenticity. And this alignment should be striven for by the people who are designing the assessment. But beyond that, we need to help students see the ways in which these things align. That placements were very much interactive, emergent, diverse, but the assessment typically were done at a computer on their own, written and capturing narrow competencies. The students want the assessment to reflect their achievements and their developing identities. And this notion of developing identities is really important in other work that I'm doing. Is the idea of portrayal. Assessment needs to help students to portray their achievements, but also who they are becoming, and to be able to strategically negotiate this portrayal for different audiences. And we need to start doing that early in the piece so that students are more comfortable about talking about who they are and what they bring and who they are becoming. And the misalignments that we saw are symptomatic of the lack of coordination between university and industry, leading to inauthentic representation of learning. And I'll say something here that I don't want to, I think there was a lot of effort that went into a lot of these designs, and there were good things about them. But when rubrics and materials and artifacts of assessment are unilaterally designed by the university and handed over to industry and said, here you go, that's not really collaborative, and that doesn't foster shared understanding between the key stakeholders. The other point here is about misalignments being opportunities for learning. So, for example, you know, there might be reasons you might do things differently in the workplace to how you learned it at university. And that is an opportunity for a conversation about the influence of context and why there might be those differences. It's not to say one is better than the other. It's just to say that there might be differences that matter and are situated. So here's a bit of theory that we started to think about in terms of assessment, and this comes from communities of practice theory. Originally, Leib and Wenger, then Wenger took it on, and what it's saying is that assessment needs to act as, in a more simple term, is that assessment needs to act as a bridge between the practices of the university and the practices of industry. And the key person here that matters is the student who tries who goes between these two practices. And so we term them the broker, but assessment as a boundary object between these two practices needs to be true, needs to have components of the university practices as well as components of the industry practices. And that's where the collaboration really matters and getting student involvement really matters. So what does that mean in perhaps more simple terms is if we think about assessment as a boundary object, then it needs to coordinate between university and practice. And the students are the brokers who are coordinating this activity and therefore making meaning between the two communities while constructing their professional identities. And so their input as well as their developing understanding about the assessment and what they are achieving really matters here. So authentic assessment needs to create space for this negotiation of meaning among stakeholders. How might we do that? How might we encourage these constructions of alignment? That's opening up opportunities for students in negotiating assessment tasks and fluidity in revising learning plans, for example, or revising assessment tasks as and when things change in the placement, is to encourage students to give students that power, if you like, isn't the right word, but the give them the ability to seek feedback and to speak up and say, you know, maybe this assessment isn't really going to work for this. Is to encourage students to reflect on the misalignments as actual opportunities for learning, and to think a bit more about how we might assess performativity and portrayal that privileges their developing professional identity. The work of Gloria Dalalba from the University of Queensland says that we have often privileged epistemology in assessment, i.e. knowledge. We need to also start to privilege ontology, the who the person is and what they bring and who they want to become. To make something authentic, you need to have both. And so the question here is, how do we make things better? This is my last slide, and I'm sorry, I realize I've gone a bit over. So some practical suggestions. If employability is dynamic and adaptive, and work certainly is, how can assessment emulate this? And so these are just some suggestions. Maybe some three-way feedback conversations might be one way of doing it. And in other work that I do, is a lot of feedback research. And I'm often asked when I talk about feedback is, you know, this is very time consuming. How do we do this? And so my argument is that, yeah, we're all time poor. How do we optimize the learning in the time that we have? And maybe spending 20 minutes writing feedback at the end of a unit on a report where the student has already moved on to the next unit of study isn't the best time spent of that 20 minutes. And maybe we can front end that and make that a shared conversation about, evaluative judgment and helping students understand, what does good look like in this workplace? What does this standard look like? Excuse me, one second. And maybe some more agile forms of assessment that promote student choice of portrayal. Audio diaries, for example, could be a really good way of capturing students' day-to-day experiences. Perhaps there might be opportunities to record some performances in the workplace and have a commentary about them and how what the meaning that students are making about these activities. Involvement of industry in unit review, assessment and moderation. Assessment and feedback literacy is something we're really working on, and that's the idea that we need to help students and industry and everyone understand the purposes of assessment and feedback more deeply, and then finally ask students about their experiences of alignment and authenticity. That's the way to find out if and whether your assessment is authentic. So this is the paper the work I've just presented comes from, and this is a guide that's really available that we wrote that it sets out a set of principles that we think really matter for authentic will assessment. we also have some case studies, and we talk about why these things matter and how we might enact them in our modern workplaces. And these are my slides. Thank you very much.